They called her the broken dove of Eldoria. Once, Lady Elara had moved through the marble halls of her father's castle like a melody given form, her laughter a bright, chiming thing that echoed off the stone. She was the jewel of Duke Valerus's court, destined for a brilliant match that would weld his power to another great house. But that was before the fall. Not a fall from grace, not yet, but a literal, violent fall from a panicked steed during a hunt. The incident had shattered her left leg, leaving it a twisted, rebellious limb that answered to her will only with a searing protest of pain. It forced upon her a halting, grotesque limp. Worse, a shard of rock had opened a deep gash along her cheekbone, healing into a puckered, silver scar that pulled at her eye and distorted her smile. In an instant, the melody had become a dissonance. The jewel was now a flawed stone, worthless on the political market. Her father, the Duke, was a man carved from ambition and ice. He saw the world not in shades of love and duty, but in assets and liabilities. His daughter, once his greatest asset, was now his most public liability. He could not hide her away, the whispers had already grown too loud. So he chose to cauterize the wound she represented with an act of spectacular cruelty. He gathered the nobility of the surrounding lands in the great hall, under the pretense of a midwinter feast. The air was thick with the scent of roasted boar and mulled wine, the light from 100 candles glinting off jewels and polished armor. Elara was made to sit on a simple wooden stool below the dais, her fine silks replaced with drab grey wool. The limp she was forced to display as she took her place was a preamble to the main event. When the hall was hushed, Duke Valerus rose, his voice a cold, clear bell of authority. He did not look at his daughter, but at the assembled lords and ladies. "You all knew my daughter in her prime," he began, his words dripping with a false, theatrical sorrow. "A vision of perfection. But fate, in its cruelty, has seen fit to mar that perfection. To render her unsuitable, he let the word hang in the air, a poisoned dart. A house such as ours cannot be stained by imperfection. A lineage of strength cannot be blighted by weakness." He gestured dismissively towards Elara, a flick of his wrist as if shooing away a stray dog. "She is a constant, painful reminder of what is lost. An ugly scar upon the face of our family name." Elara sat frozen, the heat of 1,000 stares pressing down on her. Each word was a physical blow. She could feel the scar on her face throb as if freshly cut. Her dignity, already a fragile, tattered thing, was being systematically unraveled, thread by thread, before the very people who had once vied for her favor. She was no longer a person. She was a symbol of shame, an object lesson in the cold calculus of power. The Duke's final pronouncement was the killing blow. He announced that she would be removed from the castle, for her presence was inauspicious. She would be given into the care of a commoner, a man who owed the Duke a service. Not sold, for that would imply she had value. She was to be disposed of, like so much refuse. The silence in the hall was absolute, a thick, suffocating blanket of shock and pity. But no one spoke out. No one dared challenge the Duke. Elara finally looked up, her gaze sweeping across the faces of the crowd, seeing not friends, but vultures. In their eyes, she saw her own reflection, a broken, ugly thing. The brand was set. Her father had declared her worthless, and the world had silently agreed. The pain in her leg was a dull ache compared to the chasm of despair that opened within her soul. The broken dove had finally had its wings torn from its body. In a different part of the city, down where the air smelled of sawdust and damp earth instead of polished wax and perfume, a man named Kalen worked. His world was one of wood and iron, of tangible things that could be shaped and mended. Kalen was a carpenter, and a master of his craft. His hands, calloused and strong, could coax poetry from a block of oak. But his heart was a hollow, silent place. A year ago, the fever had taken his wife, Elspeth, stealing the warmth and laughter from his small cottage and leaving behind only a profound, aching quiet. His daughter, 6-year-old Lyra, had not spoken a word since the day her mother was buried. She moved through the world like a little ghost, her eyes wide and haunted. Kalen's grief was a constant companion, a shadow that clung to him even in the bright afternoon sun that streamed through the windows of his workshop. He worked to forget, he worked to provide for Lyra, he worked because it was the only thing his hands remembered how to do. One evening, a steward from the Duke's castle arrived at his door. The man was imperious, his velvet cloak looking absurdly out of place amidst the wood shavings. He delivered the Duke's decree. Cailan had built the new stables for the Duke's prize horses, and the Duke was notoriously slow to pay his debts to commoners. The steward explained that, in lieu of the final payment in coin, the Duke was offering a ward. His own daughter. The steward's words were carefully chosen, painting a picture of a troubled, simple-minded girl who needed a quiet place to live out her days, away from the pressures of court. A charitable act, he called it. Cailan, a man of simple honor, knew the foul taste of a lord's lie when he heard one. He had heard the whispers, the cruel rumors about the Lady Alara. He knew this was no act of charity. It was an act of banishment. He looked at Lyra, who was hiding behind his leg, clutching a small, half-finished wooden bird he had carved for her. He remembered a time, 2 years past, at a village festival. He had seen Lady Alara then, before her accident. She wasn't dancing with the lords, she was sitting under a great oak tree, a circle of children at her feet, reading to them from a book, her voice animated and kind. The memory was so clear, a single bright spot in his memory of the ruling class. He accepted. Not for the debt, which he now knew he would never see, but for the memory of that voice. He thought of Lyra, trapped in her fortress of silence. He thought of the endless, quiet evenings in his cottage. Perhaps, he reasoned, a different kind of voice, a gentle one, could find a crack in the walls his daughter had built around herself. And so, the transaction was made. The next day, a closed carriage, plain and unmarked, rumbled to a stop before his cottage. The Duke's men, with cold efficiency, carried a small trunk inside, followed by the lady herself. Alara did not walk, she was half-carried, half-dragged, her face a pale, emotionless mask. The transition from the cold grandeur of the castle to the humble warmth of the carpenter's home was a violent sensory shock. The air no longer smelled of stone and power, but of pine resin, wood smoke, and the faint, savory aroma of vegetable stew. The echoing silence of the castle was replaced by the soft whisper of a plane against wood and the crackle of a hearth fire. It was a world away, and for Alara, it was the final confirmation of her complete and utter fall. Cailan watched the guards leave, their faces impassive. He turned to Alara, who stood trembling slightly in the center of the small room, her eyes fixed on the floorboards as if expecting them to swallow her whole. She was braced for cruelty, for the casual contempt of a common man now tasked with her keeping. She expected to be treated like a burden, a piece of unwanted furniture. Cailan saw not the broken dove, but a terrified woman drowning in shame. He saw the faint tremor in her hands and the deep, weary pain in her eyes. Without a word, he crossed the room, stoked the fire until it blazed with renewed life, and then took a thick, woolen blanket from a chest. He approached her slowly, as one might approach a frightened animal. He didn't speak. He simply draped the heavy, warm blanket over her shoulders. The wool was coarse against her skin, nothing like the silks and velvet she was used to, but it was profoundly, astonishingly warm. The simple, unthinking act of kindness was so unexpected it almost broke her. A single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek, catching on the edge of her scar. He led her to a small room at the back of the cottage. It was sparse, containing only a bed with a thick quilt, a small table, and a single chair. But it was impeccably clean. The window looked out onto a small garden, where winter-bare rose bushes stood like sleeping sentinels. "This will be yours," he said, his voice deep and steady, like the grain of the old wood he worked with. It is not a castle, but it is safe that night. As a storm raged outside, Cailan found Alara huddled in her room, shivering. She had been given a task by the Duke's steward, mending a pile of rough burlap sacks, a deliberately demeaning chore. Her noble hands, accustomed to embroidery and the delicate pages of books, were clumsy and raw. He took the sacks from her without comment and then returned with a bowl of hot stew. It was simple food, just barley and root vegetables, but it was rich and savory. He then did something that would forever alter the course of their lives. He revealed his true motive. "I do not need a servant, my lady," he said softly, his gaze not on her face but on the restless hands in her lap. "I have a daughter." Lyra. She has not spoken in a year. Not since her mother passed. He paused, the admission costing him a visible effort. I saw you once, a long time ago. At the May festival. You were reading to the children. You had them captured, hanging on your every word. He finally met her eyes, and she saw not a captor, but a desperate father. My house is silent. Too silent. I thought, perhaps you could bring words back into it. For her. I need a teacher, a companion for my child. Not a drudge. The revelation struck Elara with the force of a physical blow, but this time, it was not one of shame. It was one of shattering, illuminating purpose. He had not taken her in as a mark of her disgrace, but because he saw a use for the one part of her that was not broken, her mind. For the first time since the fall, she was not being seen as a marred object, but as a person with a skill, a gift. A single, fragile seed of her shattered dignity began to stir in the barren soil of her heart. In the quiet days that followed, a fragile truce settled over the cottage. Elara began to spend her time with Lyra. At first, the child was a skittish creature, watching her from a distance with her mother's solemn eyes. Elara didn't press. She simply sat by the fire, her injured leg propped on a stool Kaelin had fashioned for her, and she would read. She read from the one book she had been allowed to bring, a collection of old fables and myths. Her voice, at first hesitant and rusty, grew stronger each day. She poured all her thwarted intelligence, all her lonely years of education, into the tales of brave knights, clever queens, and magical beasts. Kaelin would work in the adjoining room, the rhythmic scrape of his tools a soft percussion to her narration. He never interrupted, but she knew he was listening. And slowly, Lyra began to draw closer, first sitting on the far side of the hearth, then on a stool near Elara's feet, her small, silent face rapt with attention. One evening, as the embers of the fire glowed and the cottage was wrapped in a comfortable silence, the past came calling. Kaelin was carefully oiling a newly finished rocking chair, his movements methodical and calming. Elara, watching him, felt a strange impulse to breach the unspoken peace. It was a rival, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Kaelin stopped his work, his hand stilling on the polished wood. The fall, she clarified, her hand instinctively rising to touch the scar on her cheek. It wasn't an accident. A man my father wished me to marry, Lord Marius. I had refused him. On the hunt, he rode up beside me and struck my horse with his crop. It was he who did this. She confessed it all, the humiliation, the pain, the cold calculation of her father's court. She expected him to recoil, to see her now only as a source of dangerous trouble. Instead, he simply nodded, his eyes filled with a deep, knowing sorrow. Then, he shared his own vulnerability. Elspeth, my wife, he began, his voice rough with unshed grief. It was so sudden. A fever that came in the night. The physician said there was nothing to be done. One day she was here, singing as she hung the laundry. The next. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. In that shared moment of confession, the chasm between noblewoman and commoner vanished. They were simply two people, marked by loss, their souls bearing scars that mirrored one another. A profound bond of empathy was forged in the quiet darkness of that room, a bridge built of shared pain and mutual respect. The spark of attraction, long dormant, was kindled by a crisis. A brutal winter storm descended upon them, a gale that howled like a famished wolf. A loose shutter on the main window began to bang violently against the cottage wall, threatening to shatter the glass. Kaelin went out into the teeth of the blizzard to fix it, while Elara and Lyra watched from the door. A powerful gust of wind caught him, and he slipped on a patch of ice. Without thinking, Elara rushed out, her own leg screaming in protest. She reached him, helping him to his feet. For a moment, they were clinging to each other in the heart of the storm, the wind and snow swirling around them. His arm was securely around her waist, supporting her, and her hands were pressed flat against the solid wall of his chest. It was not a lover's embrace, but it was charged with an intimacy that transcended words. In that moment, he was her protector, and she, his. The shared danger and the simple, desperate act of holding on to one another lit a quiet fire between them. From then on, their language became increasingly silent. A shared glance over Lyra's head as she finally smiled at one of Ilara's stories. The way he would leave a freshly carved flower on her table in the morning. The way she would ensure a hot meal was waiting for him when he came in from the cold, his hands numb. The little girl, their shared purpose, was the anchor of this unspoken affection, a constant, innocent presence that drew them together into the semblance of a family. But the world outside their fragile shelter would not leave them in peace. As winter thawed, their unusual arrangement became the subject of vicious town gossip. Calen, once respected for his skill, was now viewed with suspicion and scorn. How had a simple carpenter come to house the Duke's disgraced daughter? The whispers were poisonous, insinuating coercion or depravity. Commissions for his work dried up. People who had once greeted him warmly now crossed the street to avoid him. The economic pressure mounted, and soon, they were struggling to buy even basic necessities. The Duke, it seemed, was not content with merely banishing his daughter, he intended to grind her into the dirt, along with anyone who showed her kindness. The siege reached its peak when a summons arrived. Duke Valerus commanded their presence at the castle. The walk through the town was an ordeal of public shaming. People stared, pointed, and muttered. When they were brought before the Duke in his private study, he was the very picture of contemptuous power. He sneered at Ilara's simple dress and at Calen's work-worn clothes. "I see you have adapted well to the sty," he said to Ilara. "I had hoped this lesson in humility would chasten you. Instead, you seem to have dragged this poor fool down with you." He turned his cold fury on Calen. "Your business is failing, I hear. The price of harboring filth." He then offered a cruel bargain: send Ilara away to a remote convent for the mentally afflicted, and the Duke would restore Calen's patronage. It was in that moment that Ilara's newfound strength, forged in the hearth of Calen's home, erupted. "He is a more noble man in his heart than you have ever been in your title," she said, her voice clear and ringing with conviction. "He gave me a home when you cast me out. He gave me a purpose when you branded me useless." The Duke was stunned into silence by her defiance. For the first time, she had not cowered. They left the castle with nothing but the Duke's final, chilling threat: "Ruin will be your only inheritance." That night, they sat before a meager fire, the last of their firewood burning low. Poverty was no longer a threat, it was a reality. Despair hung in the air, thick and cloying. They had defied the Duke, and now they would pay the ultimate price. It was in this crucible of shared hopelessness that the final wall between them crumbled. Calen reached across the small space and took her hand. His touch was warm and certain. "I would choose this ruin with you 1,000 times over," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "than a kingdom without you." Ilara looked at him, at his honest, weary face, and saw not a carpenter, but a king. "And I," she replied, her voice breaking, "have found more worth in this small cottage than I ever knew in my father's castle. I love you." Calen. Their confession was not a passionate cry, but a quiet, desperate statement of fact in a world that had left them with nothing else. Their love was their last possession, and their only act of rebellion. In the days that followed their confession, a change came over Ilara. The despair sharpened into a blade of pure resolve. Her father had taught her the rules of his world, the intricate dance of law, power, and property. He thought he had cast her out of that world, but he had forgotten one crucial thing: he could not take away what she had learned. She spent hours in quiet contemplation, her mind, so long a prison of shame, now becoming a weapon. She remembered conversations she had overheard as a child, hushed arguments between her father and his stewards about land deeds and ancient charters. A memory surfaced, hazy at first, then sharpening into focus: a dispute over the deed to the old mill, the very heart of the town's economy, which her father had acquired under questionable circumstances years ago. She realized his power was not built on stone, but on paper, and paper could be challenged. Their first step was to find an ally. Ilara remembered Father Theron, the old village priest who maintained the parish archives. He was a man of quiet integrity who had long disliked the Duke's avarice and pride. They went to him by night. At first, he was hesitant, fearful of the Duke's wrath. But as Ilara laid out her suspicions, citing specific details of a land charter law she recalled from her studies, the priest's scholarly curiosity overcame his fear. He saw the truth in her logic and the honor in their cause. He agreed to help them search the archives. At the same time, Kaelin made a decision that would turn the tide of public opinion. The roof of the local orphanage had been badly damaged in the winter storm, and the town council had no funds to repair it. Using the last of his own timber, Kaelin spent 3 days, single-handedly, mending the roof. He asked for nothing in return. The townspeople, who had scorned him, watched this act of selfless charity. They saw a good man, pushed to the brink, still caring for the most vulnerable. The whispers began to change from gossip to grudging admiration. The final confrontation was not a clash of swords, but of wits and wills. After a week of secret, candlelit research, Father Theron found it, the original charter for the mill lands, granted to the townspeople centuries ago, with a clause stating it could never be privately owned, only leased. The Duke's deed was a clever forgery, built upon a series of falsified documents. Armed with this proof, Ilara devised a plan. They didn't go to the Duke, they went to the people. At the next market day, Kaelin stood upon a cart in the center of the square, and Ilara, standing beside him, her limp and scar visible for all to see, laid out the truth. She didn't shout or accuse. She simply presented the facts, her voice calm and rational, as Father Theron held up the ancient, wax-sealed charter for all to see. She used her father's own logic against him, exposing not just his crime but his hypocrisy. He had branded her for a physical flaw while his entire fortune was built upon a fundamental moral flaw. The Duke, summoned by the commotion, arrived in a fury, but it was too late. The people were no longer cowed by his title. They saw him for what he was, a thief. A delegation of town elders, emboldened by the undeniable proof and the shifting tide of public opinion, declared his deed void. He was not imprisoned or exiled. His punishment was far more fitting. He was socially and politically neutralized, left with his castle and his title, but stripped of the respect and power he craved above all else. He was left a hollow man in a hollow fortress, a perfect mirror of the disgrace he had tried to inflict upon his daughter. Ilara and Kaelin returned not to a castle, but to their small, love-filled cottage by the edge of the woods. They did not reclaim her old life, they chose to continue building their new one, a life defined not by birthright, but by earned happiness and mutual respect. Kaelin's business thrived once more, his integrity now his greatest advertisement. Their home, once a place of refuge, became a symbol of their quiet, triumphant love. Their victory was not in riches or status, but in the freedom to live and love on their own terms. One sun-drenched afternoon, Ilara was sitting in the garden with Lyra, sketching the birds that came to a feeder Kaelin had built. She had drawn a small, vibrant bluebird, its head cocked as if listening to a secret song. Lyra, who had been watching silently, reached out a small finger and gently touched the image on the page. She looked from the drawing to Ilara, her eyes filled with a new and wondrous light. A sound, soft as the rustle of a leaf, formed on her lips. It was a word she had not spoken in over a year, a word that healed the last of the wounds in their small family and signified the complete rebirth of their world. "Mama," she whispered. True nobility, Ilara realized as she pulled the little girl into her arms, is not a title you are born with, but a quality you forge in the fires of adversity. It is not measured by the flawlessness of one's face or the straightness of one's limbs, but by the integrity of one's heart. Worth is not something that can be given or taken away by the judgment of others. It is discovered in the quiet moments of kindness, earned in the defense of what is right, and found in the simple, profound courage it takes to love and be loved, wholly and unconditionally. Their new kingdom was small, its walls made of wood and its riches measured in laughter and love, but it was the truest kingdom she had ever known.